Well, good morning, my friend, and welcome to the Pastor's Podcast, December the 17th. I hope that you're having a good start to the week. Here it is, Christmas season. I hope that you're getting ready. Don't know if you've got all of your presents. Some do, some don't. Some are still going to wait for the last minute. Whatever you're going to do, I hope you have a good time this season. And of course, let's stay faithful serving the Lord. And I've got 2 Sundays left in this year, 2 Saturdays left. That means we've got 2 weeks left to make 2024 count for the Lord. I hope that you're doing that. Last night, I had a wonderful time out going soul winning, was following up on one visitor that came on Sunday night to our Christmas cantata. His cousin and asked me to come and talk to him. And so set an appointment last night, went over, and then got to talk to the brother of the man from our church. Got to lead both these people to Christ. That was exciting. And I'm looking forward to them being back this coming Sunday. As they said, we'll be there this Sunday, preacher. And that's always a good thing right there when people promise to come back and they're going to, and probably, hopefully, let's continue to follow the Lord's obedience, what the Lord wants us to do. And I hope that you stay busy during this Christmas season. Let's not forget Christ during this season. How about that? Let's not forget the reason why he came. The reason why he came was to seek and to save that which was lost. So that's the whole reason of the season. And if that's the reason of the season, then let's not forget it. I know there's a lot of preachers out there that, and I know I'm barking up a tree here a little bit, but I get tired of these preachers making it sound like, oh, you got to spend time with family. What's the purpose of Christmas, my friend? If this was family, is this a family day? Then I understand. This is about Christ. I'm not against family time. My family knows that. I love my wife, love my daughter, my son-in-law. They all know I spend time with them, but I'm afraid too many preachers are looking for an excuse to get out of church. And on Christmas Day, we're going to have church. Why? Because it's on a Wednesday. We don't change church time because it's Christ's birthday. Go figure that one out. I just don't understand the mentality of a lot of guys. And I hope that you stay faithful to whatever you're doing. Let's be faithful to church. And now I'll say this: if your church cancels the whole midweek service, you might ought to look for a different church. I'm not saying that every church has to do it on Wednesday. If you change your time, that's what a local church does. Canceling church, that's a different story. I don't think much of a church like that, and I wouldn't stay in a church like that if I was you. Let's be faithful to church. Let's see what God's going to do. Well, today let's talk about a faith worth following. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 4, the scripture says, "Since we heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and of the love which ye have to all the saints." Now, Paul said about the faith of the believers who attended the church at Colossae that since he heard of their faith and love for the saints, now it caused him to give thanks to God for them and pray for them. Now, your faith, get this now, ought to be a faith worth following. Your life's testimony ought to be a life of faith that would cause others to want to follow. Sadly, the faith of many believers doesn't do anything for the lost or the saved because their faith is so anemic. In fact, it actually causes people not to desire to follow the Lord or get saved. One of my hobbies is that I like to do is I love to read biographies or autobiographies of people whom God has used mightily in the past. As I read about their lives, and right now I'm reading about some of the men that somebody else wrote about, my heart gets stirred to follow their faith. I see the faith of these men in the past, and I feel like, man, my faith is so small. I wish these men were alive so I could talk to them a little bit and find out how they do all this, how they have that faith. Now I understand it, but it stirs my faith when I read the book of Acts. I am provoked to want God to do something great and mighty in my life and ministry, as He did in the lives and the ministries of those in the early church in the book of Acts. Now, there's something about the faith of those whom God has used mightily that provokes those who have a heart for God to want to emulate so they can see God use them in the same way. Now, there are three things your faith ought to do to others. One, your faith ought to convict others. People should see your life and be convicted that they're not doing the same things that you're doing for God. People should see how God is using you. And it should prick their heart that their faith is shallow and dying. Nobody is convicted by a life with a faith that never does anything for God. But people are convicted by the lives of those whose faith caused them to do great works for God. Now, you will never have a faith that convicts others if you're not serving God. You have to serve God before he can use you mightily. And if you're not attempting something great as you serve God, your faith will not convict anybody else. Second, your faith ought to challenge others. So your faith, it should convict, but it should challenge. Your faith should move others to action. And because of what God's doing through your life, a dead or an anemic faith will not challenge anyone to do something great for God. There's something about the faith of David or Gideon that causes everyone who reads about what God did through them that say, "Well, I want God to do that through me." If you don't have that inside of you, man, you're dead. Good night. I read their faith. Their faith challenges me. Your faith ought to challenge others to serve God. It ought to challenge them to attempt great acts for God. Third, your faith ought to give others a greater vision of faith. People ought to see your life, and it should provoke them to increase their vision of what they want to do for God. Nobody looks at a life that is doing nothing and says, "Well, I want to do that in my life." No, people look at those who've accomplished something great for God, and they're stirred to increase their vision to do something great for God themselves. Now, let me ask you: is your faith a faith that others would want to follow? Listen to me. Does your faith convict anyone for their lack of service? Does it challenge others to attempt great acts of faith because they see what God's doing through your life? Does it increase the vision of others because of what God has done through your life? Now, if you don't attempt the miraculous, God dead sure isn't going to do it through you. God's done the miraculous through those who step out by faith. I think in my own life, as a young teenage boy, I grew up in California. Just north of me was a church by Dr. Jack Trieber. And I watched his church grow from a few hundred to a couple thousand at the time. I think 1,000, maybe 2,000 at the most by the time I graduated. I'm not sure where it was at that point, but it stirred me. His faith stirred my faith. I watched Brother Hiles throughout my whole childhood. I've watched that church grow. And I remember in the old auditorium when they didn't have they didn't have the mezzanine, they didn't have the pop out of the balcony. I was there. I can remember that. And I watched what Brother House did. And then I worked in his ministry and got to see the thousands of people saved. My friend, it stirred me. It stirred me. I read about Lee Robertson. I got to know him at the end of his life. He was my first pastor, but I got to know him at the end of my life. And man, his faith stirs me. I read about Dallas Billington. It stirs me. It convicts me. It challenges me. Oh, my friend, somewhere we've got to have a faith that causes others. They ought to see that you're leading people to Christ. Well, I want to lead people to Christ like that person does. They ought to see your church baptizing every Sunday. Well, I want to see God do that through my church, and God can, my friend. The people ought to see God doing something through your life and say, "Boy, man, if God could only do that through me." You know what stirred me was just watching preachers from the past. Many of them are now gone to heaven now, and watch what God did to them. And as a young man, it stirred my heart to say, "Boy, I want God to do that through me." Now, if you get a faith that is worth following, you'll be surprised how people will want to follow it. I think our problem today is this: we have people that are they like to follow people because they're worldly and because they're doing less. I would hate to follow someone who's doing less so that because what should I say? It justifies in my mind, it validates my lack of serving God. A lot of guys out there backing up, canceling their buses, cut back on soul winning. And then they want to attack the past preachers and make it sound like these past preachers are so terrible, but they themselves are saved because of the influence of these past preachers. They don't ever talk about that. My friend, I want my faith to challenge people. And I'm not going to throw people in the past under the bus. I want to increase. I want to see more bus routes, and I want to see more people saved. I want to see more people baptized because I read those men in the past and I see what God did to them. And I said, "Boy, I want God to do something through me." I'll tell you this, and I'll be done. I remember Brother Howes used to say that he's never seen a man after 40 build a church. I took this church at 48 years of age. And I said, I want to do something that even he said that couldn't be done. You know why? Because I watched God do something through his ministry. And I said, you know what? I want to see God do something great here. And I'm not done. My vision's great. My drive is as strong as it's ever been. Oh, I may not have the energy I want you to have, but I still push just as hard. And God's doing something mighty. And may I tell you, if you get that type of faith, the faith that gives you a vision, the faith that says, let's do something great for God, we can do something great. 2025 ought to be a year that we say, let's do the greatest work for God we've ever done. Let's double what we're doing. How about that? Let's see God do something mighty through us. Well, I hope this is a challenge to you today. Now, let's remember today as we go throughout this day, be good to everyone. Everyone's having a tough time. Have a great day, my friend.